Well, hello, everyone. This is Pastor Logan. I'm with Pastor Ryan here. Just wanted to record a brief video where we discuss just the three different ballot measures that are going to be on the South Dakota ballot for the 2020 election, things that we'll be voting on. And we just wanted to give a quick overview of each of those three measures, and then maybe provide some just things to consider as we approach the election. Some of you may have already voted, recognize that, but better late than never. So the first measure is just the South Dakota Constitutional Amendment B regarding Deadwood sports betting, legalizing that. That measure would make it legal within the city limits of Deadwood, South Dakota for sports betting to take place. And according to the measure, the proceeds would be used for the historic restoration and preservation of Deadwood. And just one thing to note is that as of March of 2020, there's only 13 states in the United States that have legal sports betting. As far as outcomes of that measure would go, if you vote yes, it would support amending the state constitution to authorize the state legislature to legalize sports betting within the city limits of Deadwood. And then the proceeds would then go to those things. A no vote would oppose authorizing the legislature to legalize sports betting in Deadwood. Yeah, it was a little bit interesting with that one, Ryan. I know that the definition of restoration and preservation of Deadwood is a little ambiguous, maybe. But what considerations would you want to think through as this measure comes to the ballot?
Yeah, one of the first things that strikes me about this measure is it's interesting that it legalizes sports betting within Deadwood's city limits. You'd think if there's nothing wrong with sports betting, then open it up for the entire state. Why is it specifically within one town in the entire state? It's okay there, but it's still not okay everywhere else. So that just on the surface shows you there's a problem here. There's some attempt to justify it within city limits. It's okay there, but not other places. When it comes to gambling and betting, some of the factors that I think about, there was an article I came across years ago that's been really helpful for me, where the author really defined gambling, showed kind of the key components, what has to be present for gambling to be there. One is some sort of chance, some bet based on a future uncertain outcome. So there's chance involved, and in this case it's sports betting, so the outcome of the game is uncertain. There have to be stakes involved. Both parties are agreeing to give something up, to forfeit something if things don't turn out the way that they're betting they will. So then there's a wager that both parties are agreeing, I will risk losing my money in exchange for the opportunity to take your money. And there's no fair compensation in a bet. There's no exchange of goods, no exchange of services. So basically what you have in gambling or betting, it's always a situation where one party wins at the expense of the other. And so this really falls under the area of exchange of property or goods. And I think when we look to scripture, what does the Bible say about how we exchange property and goods? There are several legitimate ways that can happen. One is just through hard work. And so scripture talks a lot about work ethic, has a lot to say about being paid for your work. So 1 Timothy 5:18, for example, where Paul is actually quoting Jesus, the laborer is worthy of his wages. So work is a legitimate thing. You can get paid in exchange for work. You can buy and sell property. That's legitimate. You can give freely through generosity, and we're called to give generously. So those are legitimate ways of exchanging property. And then there are certain illegitimate ways, like stealing, taking somebody else's goods. And so I think gambling falls into that category of two parties are agreeing to attempt to take the other's stuff without losing anything at all. And so sometimes people wonder, well, isn't it isn't it similar to the risk involved in, say, investing or starting a business? There are lots of uncertain outcomes, or buying an insurance policy that's about an uncertain future. But those things are very different. Anytime you're starting a business or investing in stock, you're actually trying to create a legitimate good or service that provides some benefit to other people. The risk involved is the product might not work, the business might not succeed, but you are not attempting to profit at somebody else's expense. That's not the aim there. Gambling, the aim is always to profit at somebody else's expense. And it's an area where our culture is convinced consent is the end all for everything. As long as people consent to it, it's okay. But consent is not this trump card that you can just play and say, well, as long as two adults consent to it, it's okay. There are lots of things people may consent to do that are still wrong. So those are some of the biblical considerations, the categories I put this in, exchange of goods and property, stealing, God's prohibition there. And then there are all of the social impacts, the impact on a society when people engage in gambling and betting. And so again, if it's a sinful thing, should people still be free to do it? I think the ramifications in a society are massive. And so we won't go through all of those details, but I think there's enough there to be quite concerned about as Christians.
Yeah. I think just one thing I would add is that it also seems to go against the proverbial warning of gaining money hastily. And so right along the lines of working hard and being compensated for your work, just this desire to win big, strike it big instantly. The Proverbs warn against that. So let's move on to the second ballot measure, which is the initiated measure 26, including which is the medical marijuana initiative. The details of that measure are that individuals with what they would call debilitating medical conditions would be permitted to possess a maximum of 3 ounces of marijuana. And certain patients would also be able to grow or cultivate up to 3 different marijuana plants at their home. A yes vote would support establishing a medical marijuana program in South Dakota for individuals that meet that debilitating medical condition. And a no vote would oppose establishing a medical marijuana program in South Dakota. So as far as this initiated measure 26 goes, it has some similarities with the next one regarding Amendment A. We'll get to that in a little bit. Anything that you would say regarding things we should be aware of with this initiative 26?
Yeah, I think a factor that makes this somewhat complicated is that medicinal uses of certain substances are permitted. There's grounds for that in the Bible. Proverbs speaks of giving alcohol to those who are suffering. Paul tells Timothy, drink some wine for your stomach, your ailment. So medicinal purposes for certain substances can be legitimate. We do have pharmacies that give out narcotics for medical conditions. And so I think the medicinal use, I've heard of various conditions that might be helped by medical marijuana. I think that the pause for me anyway, when it comes to this issue, is that it does seem like it might be a backdoor route toward Amendment A, which we'll get to in a second, which has to do with recreational marijuana use. There may be some medicinal uses for marijuana, cancer patients, seizures, some of those things. But the interesting thing here is that it permits patients to grow their own plants at home. Under medically prescribed circumstances, that seems strange that patients aren't going to a pharmacy, that their access isn't regulated more strictly. And we know already the problems that exist of abuses of prescription drugs when there is some higher level of oversight by a doctor and a pharmacist. If abuses exist there, it's interesting that this opens up the door for people just to grow and cultivate their own. So it seems like it's a step. And even we were just talking before we hit record about somebody in the medical community who said that that's kind of his perception, and seems to be from others, that this is really just a shift toward normalizing more recreational use of marijuana. So that's probably my major concern here.
There's probably a fuller treatment that we can give to just the issue of marijuana in society with South Dakota Constitutional Amendment A. So that one, the details of that amendment would, recreational marijuana use would be allowed for people over the age of 21. So people could possess or distribute up to 1 ounce of marijuana. This one also includes the people could grow up to 3 marijuana plants in their residence. This one tacks on a 15% sales tax to people buying and selling recreational marijuana, and then they say that they'll use the revenue which would be created because of that tax to fund public school. Well, first of all, it would be used to I guess whatever needs to take place to get it operational within the state, and then revenue would go to schools at 50%, and then the other would go to the general state fund. 50% of it would go to that. So a yes vote would support the constitutional amendment, legalize the recreational use of marijuana, and require the South Dakota State Legislature to pass laws providing for the use of medical marijuana and the sale of hemp by April 1st, 2022. And no vote would oppose legalizing marijuana for recreational use, and requiring the state legislature to pass laws providing for the use of medical marijuana and the sale of hemp. So what in scripture should we be mindful of when we think of, now we're moving beyond the category of just medical marijuana use for a specific purpose. Now we're talking recreational use. What consideration should we have regarding that?
This one also, right on the surface, just strikes me as funny that the law would permit people to grow up to 3 marijuana plants in their residence. Again, if there's nothing wrong with the recreational use, why not 4 or 5 or 50? Or we don't say you can have 3 corn stalks in your yard, or I mean, if it's permitted, why is it limited? And it seems to be because there's a desire to monetize something here. And so when that's thrown in, that, hey, 50% of the proceeds from the sales tax on this is going to go to benefit public schools, I think that's an attempt for many people to justify this in their minds, that, well, it goes to a good cause. But of course, if people just grow it in their own house, that limits how much you can profit off of it, because maybe they're going to grow some for others and it's not going to be bought and sold and whatever. So biblically, again, thinking about the area of like alcohol, because the Bible doesn't say anything about marijuana plants, but it does talk about alcohol, which is a substance that can affect your brain state. There are biblically permissible uses of alcohol. It's used in the Lord's Supper, so there's a sacramental use there. It's used in celebration. That's legitimate. Just the aesthetic value of it. When Jesus changes water into wine, there's a comment about the best wine. So Jesus didn't just turn water into wine, he turned water into the best wine, which means it tasted good. So there's an aesthetic value to alcohol as well. So there are legitimate uses there, but then there are illegitimate uses of alcohol. The Bible clearly prohibits drunkenness and debauchery in Ephesians 5:18 and tons of other passages. Debauchery is this overindulgence, this excessive indulgence in it. And so when it comes to something like alcohol, there's a line between aesthetic enjoyment, celebration, etc., and the overindulgence, debauchery, drunkenness. And I think then shifting to marijuana, the only aim in recreational marijuana use is drunkenness, or a drug-induced high. What it creates that kind of brain fog. The only recreational use is overindulgence, excessive indulgence, or debauchery. Yeah. So recreational is really a euphemism to make it sound like, I mean, you're not playing catch with your kids. That is not that kind of recreation. Recreational use means you're getting high off of this. That's all it's used for. Nobody's using it for the taste, the aesthetic value of it. And so the only use then would fall in that illegitimate category. So I think that's a major concern. And I think people would argue possibly, well, yes, it may be a sin for Christians to get high on marijuana, um, but biblically, isn't there a distinction between sins and crimes? Not everything that is a sin is necessarily a crime. And that's true. And I think that there could be a legitimate conversation about what the criminal penalties are for marijuana possession or marijuana use. There could be some room for reform there in the civil penalties. But we're not talking about that on this particular ballot measure. We're talking about legalizing the recreational use of marijuana. And when it comes to our freedoms, our liberties, I think there's a secular libertarianism that just says, basically, I think it's a step toward anarchism. Leave me alone. Don't tell me what to do. People should be free to do whatever they want to do. And as Christians, we understand liberty is a certain kind of thing. It's not freedom to do whatever I want to do. Liberty is freedom to do what's right to do. Freedom is not for indulgence in sin. That's not a legitimate use of freedom. So those are some of the considerations. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's all good. I think one of the other things is when you consider the 15% sales tax that's included on the sale, like you said, if people are growing it, is there really even going to be revenue generated from that? Maybe. But I think when you even consider in principle what a sales tax of 15% does, it's very similar to like other sin taxes. And the problem with taxes like that are that puts society in a position of benefiting off of the overindulgence or the sin of others. So whether that be, gambling, whether that be, there's been certain tobacco taxes like that, or in this case, marijuana, it's benefiting off of the sin or the getting high of others in society. So it really has kind of like unaligned incentives there, where because you're potentially getting money from it, you want people, you're okay with people sinning more because, and then like you had mentioned, it kind of appeases your conscience by saying, oh, we'll fund the school system or we'll fund the state in this regard. But
it totally seems like a way to win the votes of those who aren't going to use marijuana recreationally. Because if they had to pass this based only on the votes of people who are going to use marijuana, they wouldn't have enough votes. So they have to get votes from people who aren't going to use it recreationally. So how do you win those votes? Well, you tell them we're going to charge 15% on tax on the sale of this. But imagine if we did that to groceries, people would be up in arms. So why do we add this exorbitant tax on certain things? Well, it's because some people are like, well, I'm not going to pay it, so I don't care. And it's going to go to schools, and I like that, so I'll vote for this because then I can tell myself I'm voting for schools, which you're not.
Yeah. And I think there's not a lot of, I guess, clear evidence. I mean, you could go to the states where it's been recreationally legal and see the effects that have had. Maybe there's not like clear one-to-one, here's how the society is going to turn bad or whatnot. But I think it's worth considering, how does this affect families, or how does this affect society at large? I think in that kind of liberty mindset, we think, oh, we can just do whatever we want with no effect on anyone around us.
Right.
I don't know if we have a clear understanding that it won't have, larger societal effects. So I think in that regard, those are things to consider. So
yeah, it does. I mean, it's impossible to avoid the fact that we all legislation is legislating morality. It's not a matter of whether we're going to legislate morality. It's a matter of which morality is going to be legislated. So in the laws that are passed and the things that are permitted and not permitted, a strong message is sent to society. What kind of culture are we going to be? What do we tolerate and what do we not tolerate? And so it does, when our legislature decriminalizes something, legalizes something, there is an implied affirmation given. This is okay. This is okay to do. And so what effect does that have on upcoming generations? I had shared a quote with you earlier, and I think it's worth reading here from an author named R.J. Rushdoony. Just thinking about this area of freedom. Shouldn't people be free to do things that may just be sins and shouldn't necessarily be crimes? And Rushdoony says this: the gospel of the tyrant state becomes the assertion that liberty is license to sin. And slavery is the liberty of moral self-government. In every such state, the courts and schools decree and interpret liberty as freedom from morality. So freedom is redefined as I should be free from moral standards. I should be free from any kind of expectation to do what's right. The people are deluded into believing they are a more free people because they now possess a license to fornicate, to commit adultery, to indulge in perversions freely, to read pornography. Meanwhile, as the people wallow in this quote unquote new freedom, the state rapidly extends its powers over the people, over family life, economics, education, business, labor, and agriculture, over the churches, art, science, and all things else. The promulgation of the idea that sexual and moral irresponsibility is liberty is thus the usual and necessary prelude to the destruction of liberty and the rise of statism. The so-called new freedom produces the old slavery. I think those are wise words that when we live in a country where we see people are claiming this is freedom, the ability to do what's immoral and wrong, just know that more external control follows that. Freedom comes from the gospel, which sets our hearts free, cleanses our consciences, and transforms us to be able to live self-controlled lives. Freedom is self-control, the ability to govern ourselves. Wherever self-government is missing, it is going to be replaced by external government. I mean, it's not, again, it's just not a question of whether there's going to be government. It's either going to be internal government or external coercion. And so recreational marijuana use is clearly a lack of self-government, and it will be followed by more and more other restrictions from the state.
Yeah. Well, those are helpful thoughts. Thanks for adding some considerations to those three measures. So if anybody has any questions or they want to follow up on any of those measures, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to consider those questions. In considering all of these measures, I mean, we clearly laid out some of our thoughts regarding them, but if you're uncertain on how something will change the law, when the consideration is whether or not to add amendments or to change the law, a no vote is always going to leave the law as it is. So that's always something helpful if you're unsure if there's one, obviously there's only 3 amendments this year, but in past years, there's been quite a bit more. So we hope these thoughts are helpful to you as you vote this year. And we're considering maybe doing another video regarding maybe, voting in our national election, what that might look like. So Ryan, do you have any closing thoughts?
Not really. I just hope that's helpful, and welcome any other feedback or input or questions from people.
Awesome. Well, that'll do it for now. And thanks for tuning in.